The Cinders of Dezu, written and read by Tonic. A tyrant king, a missing girl, and a journey through a perilous world. Join me for this completed sci-fi fantasy novel read as an audio series. Enjoy the story from here on, or binge from the beginning with the first episode. The episodes are now available on YouTube and Spotify as a podcast. Like and subscribe if you enjoy. My audiobooks are totally free. If you'd like to donate to support my writing, though, check out my Patreon in the description. And now, back to the tale. Chapter 18. Linga. From the cliffs, Julian watched without realizing how hard he was pressing both his palms into the sides of his head. When he saw Cairo deliberately dive beneath the waves after the creature, he finally stopped and began to pace frantically. Crap, no! He stopped and looked to the ledge. Okay. He shook his hands with his fingers splayed out. He backed up and started to run for the edge. Beneath the surface, Cairo looked around. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness of the waters, he saw the tentacles of the monster propelling it deeper and towards the edge of the pool. As Linga's arm stroked the water back, he saw a light in his fist. It was the dim light of a fire, engulfed in bubbles. The fist of the sea monster shook until the light went out. He threw a figure farther down into the depths. The figure of a girl. Cairo started frantically trying to swim down, knowing before he even started that he was too far to save her. The monster's octopus-like tentacles propelled him in a wide circle as it began to go around the edge of the pool. Cairo could see the wall of the pool gave way to a deep, dark cavern underneath. The cavern stretched all around the edges of the pool, only discernible from underwater. Cairo swam as hard and as fast as he could toward the shadow of the limp young woman. Her silhouette stirred and began to slowly tread water. Cairo sparked with hope, just as he felt his body begin moving faster through the water. It was much faster than he knew his arms were capable of taking him. He stopped swimming. It felt as though he was falling towards her quickly, like he was being pulled through the water. He looked up and down until he spotted Julian wading in the water just above him. He was looking down with his arm outstretched. He wasn't reaching out to him, though. He looked like he was guiding him. He turned his head to see Talia, but he caught a glimpse of movement. He froze as he saw the beast of the lake rear its body toward them again. The gaze of Linga's ferocious face narrowed on both of the boys. He had an unmistakable shine in his eye, the look of a predator who just spotted prey. Cairo's speed suddenly increased. He looked up to see Julian had seen it too, and was now propelling them both through the water. Cairo looked ahead to Talia, who was treading water and facing them. Cairo could see her face now. She was assessing her surroundings before looking bewildered as she started quickly falling backwards without her control. In a powerful serpentine motion, Linga began his pursuit. Down and down they went with escalating speed. The darkness grew closer and closer. Cairo grew terrified of running out of air. Julian felt the fear of suffocation creeping in too, but he knew something Cairo did not. As the three of them passed through the mouth of the caverns, Julian looked up. There they were. Between broken and intact stalactites, hundreds of clams were floating on the ceiling of the underwater cave. Julian was soaring through the water with his arms out to his side. He spun like a propeller to get visual on 3 specific clams. In the same motion, he changed their polarity from the ceiling so that each clam gravitated towards them. One for Cairo, one for Talia, and one for him. Julian's powers were starting to feel like muscles he could stretch. He held the 3 of them now, along with the 3 clams. This made 6 objects at once. It didn't feel like he was maxing himself out either. So now, it was time to try his clam popping trick, and hopefully not pop his friends at the same time. The clams grew closer to each of them, nearly colliding. In unison, they snapped open. Cairo's eyes widened as the clam he just noticed in his peripheral came at him with its jaws wide. In an instant, Cairo was enclosed inside. He let air out of his lungs in a panic. When fresh air pushed water out of the shell, he was almost scared to breathe it. He finally relented. As his eyes adjusted to the translucent shell, he heard a powerful rumble. Just outside, a pillar had shattered. Several stones rained down to the cave floor. Julian, still at the back of the line, looked back to see a disturbingly close Linga opening his mouth. As he did, a force emanating from his jaws, manifesting as a ball of water, could be seen tearing through the stone columns around them. It traveled past the 3 of them in their clamshells and disappeared in the water ahead. Talia, the farthest in front, could see a light at the end of the tunnel just before the force of the displaced water spun them out of control. In the swirling confusion, Julian lost control of everyone's gravity, but managed to catch some of the falling stones and reverse their polarity in the direction of the sea monster. He temporarily slowed his pursuit as he was pelted. As they slowly rose to the ceiling of the cave, they all got a sense of the shape of their surroundings. The cave was a pathway. It was a size large enough for the creature of the lake to move from the lake to the center of the island and back again. They were traveling the hall to his sacrifice. From the ceiling between stalactites, Julian looked down to see Linga shake his head and look around for them. Cairo was beginning to realize how helpless he was without Julian carrying them through the water. Talia was measuring the distance to the surface in her head to see if she'd be able to make it if she burned her way out of the clam. Linga searched all around his tunnel and then looked up at the ceiling. Julian held his breath. Linga kept staring with reflective eyes the size of manhole covers, glistening with the light of the exit they were so close to. He seemed to be looking right at them, but he wasn't. He realized the creature's predicament. The ceiling was covered in floating air-filled clams. The 3 of them were just new additions to the pile. The monster floated up to the ceiling and shook the cave as his claws dug into the stone. He was right behind them, sniffing the mass of clams. Julian watched in horror as the creature grabbed one in his mouth and with a snap that rippled through the water, cracked open the clamshell. His fat tongue snaked out and licked the large muscle out of its home. Cairo watched as the empty shell sank slowly to the cave floor. Linga repeated the process again and again, sniffing, cracking, and slurping his way closer and closer to the 3 of them. Cairo couldn't see from his position where Julian was, but when he looked ahead, he could see Talia. He had watched where she had floated up to, when they had stopped falling toward the cave exit. He couldn't be sure how close the monster's gnashing teeth were to his friend, and he probably wouldn't until it was too late. The beast drew closer and closer, his movement shaking all the clams together in a dance with each burrowing clutch of his powerful clawed hands. Cairo was watching to see if his friend had slipped out of any of the clams to be swallowed up by the hungry mouth. He couldn't tell. His heart sank, and the pit in his stomach grew. Suddenly, the beast stopped, and looked in Cairo's direction. He froze. Could he see him? Did he finally spot him in the clear shell? No. It looked like the monster's eyes were looking through him. He almost didn't dare take his eyes off him to look where he was looking, but he finally did. There, swimming just ahead, was Talia. She was waving her arms frantically to get the monster's attention. It was working. Cairo looked back to see Linga's face form a look that he could only recognize as fury. The sea monster pushed itself off of the cave ceiling. No, Cairo thought. She can't. He wasn't going to sit by and watch this happen. He couldn't. He put both his hands on the sides of the clam. Ice filled the chamber around him. Water started to flow in as the shell began to open. The clam began to react and move as ice started to creep from the inside to the outside of the shell. Linga spotted it with a mouthful of large, shredded muscle hanging from his mouth. With a thud, he stopped short and landed back on the ceiling. He put his face over the squirming thing and watched ice crystals form larger and larger on it. His looming jaws came down with a bite. No crack. In fact, Linga's teeth didn't feel a shell at all. He felt his mouth begin to fill, cold and hard. The ice was pushing his jaws open. He bit down harder, but it was so wide, so fast, he was losing leverage for his jaw. He let go of the ceiling. Just then, a cylinder of ice came shooting out of his mouth. Linga grabbed at his teeth with his claws, trying to dig the thing out. It was wedged tight and frozen to his gums. He watched as the tube of ice extended from his mouth like a straw and headed toward his swimming prey. It engulfed her and exited the underwater cave. On the surface, just outside the island, the ice cylinder popped out with a splash and shot two figures out of its mouth. Cairo and Talia were flying across the water through the air. Ice extended around the ice tube across the water's surface. A sheet spread quickly across the water below them. Cairo extended his hands. Ice shot from them and froze more of the lake as their bodies came falling toward it. The speed of their flight sent them sliding across it as fast as they collided, yet Cairo's ice kept up. They slid dozens of feet on the slick surface, the momentum and lack of friction subduing their fall. Cairo rolled up and onto his feet as he slid. He tried to steady himself and immediately came to a stop on the ice. His hands were out to his sides as he stood still. It was abnormal. He had stopped on a dime. As he looked puzzled down at the ice, he caught a glimpse of Talia zipping past him. He spun around with his hand out, extending the ice further for her. She wasn't stopping. With a slight curve of his wrist, the ice path that froze the surface curved upward. A frozen wave curled up into the air, sliding Talia up with it. She went hurtling back through the air in Cairo's direction. She was understandably screaming now. Cairo put both his hands out and made a tube again, this time in midair that caught the flying girl. He formed it so it went up and over him. Cairo called to mind the jungle gym slides he used to ride in the kids' area in his recreation center down the street. The ice slide curved to his side, and from its open mouth popped a bewildered Talia, landing neatly into his arms. He flashed a quick half-smile before looking up, and realizing the slide he made was coming down. Like he was pulled by an unknown force, his feet slid them effortlessly and nearly instantaneously across the ice sheet and out of the way of the crashing ice structure that had been suspended in midair. It broke into large chunks as the two of them stared. Cairo was stunned. Talia turned and looked up at his dark and confused eyes, still figuring out what he'd done. She was sure he was still nearly unaware of holding her. She gave him 2 gentle slaps on the cheek. "Good job. Put me down." Cairo shook his head and almost dropped her as he suddenly felt her body in his arms. She was very firm, and yet very soft. He kept it together as he placed her feet first on the ice. Talia was trying to settle how slick the ground was when it began to move. She balanced herself as she looked down. The outline of massive moose-like antlers waited under them. A slithering body of arms and tentacles pushed the ice up as he slid just beneath their tiny frozen island. Talia slipped and almost fell as the ice cracked between the two of them. "No, actually, pick me up." She grabbed Cairo's arm and swung herself onto his back. "Go, go, go!" she yelled in his ear as she wrapped her legs around his waist. "Oh, whoa!" Cairo said as the ice started to rock and break apart. "Make more go!" Cairo looked around as the ice pieces got farther and farther apart, splashing water up to them. He put his arms out. A sheet of ice started forming rapidly, linking the pieces back together. Hang on," he said as he took a running stance. Cairo took off. He moved across the ice, not running, but jetting across it with a speed he could never have imagined. He felt like videos he'd seen of expert figure skaters, only his feet had a power to them. Not like something from muscles, but an energy, something coursing through his body that impelled him across the ice. He felt both exhilarated and terrified, as all at once he saw the crystal sheets forming ahead of him and heard the sound of shattering behind. A roar echoed across the water. A sound like a guttural churning of an engine mixed with the sound of a high-pitched, rage-induced scream. Cairo was moving fast, but the nearness of the sound made him worry he wasn't moving fast enough. The edge of the lake was perhaps 2 to 3 miles off, and even moving at what he thought could be close to a car on a city street, there was no guarantee he'd make it that far in enough time. He began to turn his head back when he felt Talia's hand grab his jaw and force him forward. She leaned into his ear to talk with wind blowing past them. "You drive. I'll handle the back view." "My rear view mirror," he said, his eyes and hands forming ice as fast as he could make them. "What?" she said. "Never mind." Talia looked back and decided what she had told him was definitely the right call. Rising above the surface were the aquatic, bony moose antlers with the furious eyes of Linga. Rushing water and chunks of ice streamed past his scaly face. He was biting through the ice sheets in massive lurches forward. Talia could see some of his tentacles peek above and between his antlers as they partially left the water behind him to propel him forward. With each powerful lurch, he got closer and closer. "Can you go faster?" Talia asked. Her tone was calm. It was meant not to disturb Cairo's focus, but it only made him more agitated as he could tell what she was doing. "I just got these powers! I don't know what I'm doing!" His legs began moving in a skating motion in an attempt to speed them up, but his body moved faster than his legs were carrying him. Talia took note that his leg movement was more doing a show of speed rather than getting them to the shore any quicker. Talia unwrapped her arms from Cairo and tightened her legs around his waist. She leaned her torso backwards until she was facing upside down. Putting her hands together, she formed orbs of flame the size of beach balls, lobbing them at the face of her pursuer. Linga closed his eyes as the orbs struck his face. She had shot him 4 times when he had finally had enough. With a final snap and shattering of ice, he and his antlers receded underwater, leaving the ice road undisturbed. Talia hung upside down for a moment, watching. The lake was quiet behind them. She leaned up and wrapped her arms around Cairo again, who had not let up his speed. "You got him?" he said. Suddenly, a hole in the ice burst open next to them. The reveal was a monstrous arm and the crazed eye of the creature peeking up at them before it quickly sunk down again. Within seconds, it happened again, but this time ahead and to the right of them. Cairo curved left quickly and kept moving. "No," said Talia. "I think I just gave him better ideas." Moss Linga slipped back under again. In seconds, his arm emerged right in front of them. When Cairo zigged to the right, a second arm emerged. Antlers and a star broke through the ice ahead, and out rose the beast. He violently swung his arms around as he rose high enough for his tentacles to start snaking through sheets of ice themselves. Cairo slid to a stop and began sliding quickly left and right, just trying to stay out of their way. He couldn't see the shore past the wicked body of the ruler of the lake. He was stumbling and struggling to keep his balance as the ice churned and was ground up under the tenacious lumberings of the monster's appendages. Talia started to slip. He started to panic and grabbed her arms to hold her up. It was no use. She slipped from his fingers before he could get a good grip. He almost fell before he turned around. Water and ice sloshed around him, but no Talia. "Talia!" he yelled as loud as he could. "Talia, no!" The sheet he was on began to lift. Cairo turned around to the curve of a rising tentacle, raising him up and out of the water. He fell forward toward the sheet of ice slanting towards him. A hand found a grip on the slippery ice with just the tips of his fingers. It was no use, though. He was in the sky now. The tentacle had thrown the ice sheet with Cairo attached. He soared through the air, his pose like a cat with its fur raised and its claws in the carpet. He was pitched high and far into the sky. Really high. Too high. Cairo turned around. There in the light of the sun was the silhouette of someone. It was too bright to see. He was getting closer to them. Someone that was floating? "You can let go now." Julian was smiling with both his arms slightly out in front of him. "So you can just fly now?" said Cairo. Julian's eyebrows jumped. "Anti-gravity, baby." His tone sounded very confident, but then his face changed and he looked up to the side contemplatively. "Well, you know what? Maybe not. Yeah, no, I think that's what this is. I can't just fly. This is way harder than it should be." He looked up and then looked down. "You know, I can't think about it too much right now. It's kind of like that OCD thing you had when we were kids, when you could breathe fine and then you thought too much about breathing and then you had to think about breathing and then you started to panic because, 'Where's Talia?' Cairo cried as he looked down towards the water. He tossed the ice sheet to the side and then immediately regretted it as he watched it plummet to the water below. He felt nakedness and horror at how high up they were. He started waving his arms and legs, trying to grasp at something. "She's right here," said Julian. Cairo turned to see Talia rise up next to Julian and look down at him. "Hey," she said with a partial smile. Cairo started to stammer. "I thought you were... He was... You thought I just fell off your back?" Cairo recalled her earlier acrobatic monster fighting. "Well, technically she did fall," said Julian. "If I'm understanding my powers right, I'm like the fall guy." Cairo shook his head and looked down as Julian laughed at his own joke. He was cut short by the loud sound of bursting water and a sizzle. Cairo looked back to see a cloud of steam next to a startled Julian. As they tried to figure out what had just happened, a body fell slumped from the cloud. "Talia!" Cairo screamed. As she dropped down from them, something was rising up. It looked like a very large and very fast approaching ball of water. Julian dropped them both down and the water ball missed them both, but not without leaving them with the intense sensation of passing heat. It was boiling hot. Julian looked frantically to find Talia's falling body, but was distracted by a sudden upwards hailstorm of boiling water balls the size of dog houses. Julian spun Cairo and himself all around, trying to dodge one after another. Julian felt hopeless to catch Talia when amongst the spinning he caught the sight of the light of flames. There she was, tumbling down and shooting water balls out of the air as she went. She was also returning fire at the source. Moss Linga had his eyes darting towards all of them, aiming and shooting from his toothy jaws. Talia was nearly to the monster's level, still risen out of the water, when Julian caught her and her fall slowed. Reaching the level of his face, a floating Talia formed wide fire rings at her sides, extended a few feet from her outstretched hands. She spun them like blades at the monster, waving her arms and striking him across the head and chest. Moss Linga began covering his face to block the heat of the strikes. "That girl is, durable," said Julian. Cairo and Julian floated a ways up from the fight, watching Moss Linga start to let himself sink a little from the jabs. Cairo looked on, a bit slack-jawed, before clearing his throat. "Dude, she is something else." "You just think she's hot," said Julian. Cairo whipped his head over to look at him. "She is hot! By definition, the girl is literally on fire right now. Look!" A fainted battle cry rang up to them as a flaming Talia increased the size of the rings and force of her swings. Julian put his arms out and started flying her around the monster so she could hit him at different angles. "You're just into her because she saved your butt and she acts like she knows everything." "She saved your butt too, like a lot already." "Yeah, but I don't have that whole dude bro and distress thing that you've got. You like a girl in shining armor." Cairo frowned. "I like capable women, and I'm not ashamed of that." "Yeah, like your ex, Miss Cuddly as barbed wire." "Dude," Cairo said with his hand up, "we are not getting into that right now." Julian laughed as he watched Moss Linga flail at Talia like a fly with a flamethrower. "This right here? This is better than video games." Cairo's nostrils flared as he looked down at the chaotic scene. "Kate, well, don't forget that's a real girl and not an avatar. You've only got one actual life against this boss." "No, I don't," said Julian. Cairo looked at him with a raised eyebrow. Julian took his eyes away from the fight for a split second to give him a smirk. "I've got two." Cairo felt himself rotating horizontally like a missile being loaded for a shot. "Jules, no. Come on, man." "Ante up, Ice Boy." Cairo didn't know what it was like to be shot from a cannon. He used to think about how the inside of a human cannon couldn't have had gunpowder, right? Was it spring-loaded? Surely a human couldn't withstand that kind of speed or an explosion under their feet. But the sheer sudden velocity at which Julian had shot him made Cairo reconsider how this mechanism probably could have worked, and whether or not he should still have a relationship with his best friend if he survived this. The laughing he had heard the split second before his launch hadn't helped either. As he approached, the monster's eyes lifted from a fire-swirling Talia to an already terrified Cairo. His toothy trap of a mouth snapped open, and a heavy stream of boiling water went straight up in his direction. Cairo put his arms out. The boiling water almost immediately started to solidify. Cairo kept his hands out as he was now careening toward a solid cylinder of ice. As if it were listening to his thoughts, a hole formed down the center, turning the solid shape into a tube. Cairo tumbled into the tube and found himself sliding perilously into the monster's open throat. From outside, Talia watched as the beast gnawed at the protuberance coming from his mouth like a crazed dog. He was beginning to choke. As Cairo tumbled, displaced ice created sharp protrusions that followed him on the outside of the icy straw. Talia watched Moss Linga's crazed eyes widen as the icicle prying open his jaws grew spikes that advanced closer and closer to his face. He grabbed at it with his claws, only to have them relentlessly driven through. A fleshy squelch signaled Cairo had reached the back of the throat. Hey guys, it's Oliver. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more. Give me your thoughts in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. And check my channel to make sure you're caught up on the latest episode. I'll have regular episodes up until all chapters of this story are fully released, so stay tuned.